Previously on this channel, on 2 occasions, we have made reference to the accident of China Airlines Flight 611, occurring on May 25, 2002. It is time that we dedicate a whole video to this accident. The disaster itself occurred in a single moment. When investigators analysed the flight data and cockpit voice recordings, the flight seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary, a very routine flight on a very unexemplary day. But to understand where the problem that brought this plane down came from, we need to head back in time, looking at the accident plane's history, and even analyse the events of one day many years before the notable accident. The disaster of Flight 611 involved a Boeing 747-200. This particular 747, first registered as Bravo 1866, was built in 1979 and was delivered to China Airlines in Taiwan in July of that year, where it would stay and operate for the company until the accident. During its 23-year life, it accumulated nearly 65,000 flight hours across 21,000 total flights. China Airlines used this particular plane frequently on a route between Taipei and Hong Kong. This is one of the most widely travelled air routes in the world. Though it's only a short flight for a large plane like the 747, China Airlines saw the capacity of the plane to be ideal to keep up with demand for the journey. After all, China Airlines was not alone in that regard. Inter-megacity flights in Asia needed larger planes. Japan Airlines, for example, even used them on some of their domestic routes. Though China Airlines is a Taiwanese airline, and the accident in question occurred over the Taiwan Strait, we'll come back to the accident's events later, we must direct our attention to Hong Kong. On February 7, 1980, less than 1 year into the plane's life, this Boeing 747 was travelling between Stockholm and Taipei with multiple intermediate legs. The plane was flying a leg between Jeddah and Hong Kong when something rather unusual happened to the aircraft's skin. The plane was being flown into Hong Kong, which in 1980 had a very unusual airport. It went by the name of Kai Tak and was famous among pilots and aviation enthusiasts. The airport demanded an unconventional approach to the runway, requiring pilots to fly deliberately towards terrain and make a sharp right turn seconds before touchdown. The surviving video footage of Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport is rather spectacular. China Airlines in 1993 even suffered a hull loss of another 747 at the airport for unrelated reasons than what needs to be discussed today. We already have a video on that accident. Despite Kai Tak's unusual means of operation, no fatal accident had ever occurred in relation to that unconventional approach. At the airport, that is. Because what happened to the accident plane in Flight 611 on that day in 1980 set the events in motion for what would take place in 2002. In the final seconds before touchdown, after the pilots turned the plane in that striking right-hand turn, the skin on the underside of the tail section of the aircraft scraped the runway. This is commonly referred to as a tail strike. Later that evening, the 747 was expected to continue to Taipei as normal. However, the damage done to the plane meant it was ferried back to Taiwan unpressurized to be repaired. Once in Taiwan, the plane was serviced to repair the damage done. A temporary repair was initially carried out, with a so-called permanent repair performed months later. It is highlighted that this maintenance was performed poorly. So let's examine what work was actually done. The plane's logbook only made a brief mention of the tail strike incident. The damage covered a substantial surface area of the plane's skin. Cracks and scratches had formed deep into the aluminium alloy. For this plane to be repaired in accordance with Boeing's own standards, in retrospect, the entire section of skin needed to be removed and replaced. This was not what happened here. Instead, China Airlines engineers suggested that this was too large of a piece to simply remove. Instead, the area was sanded down and a patching plate was installed on top of the damaged skin. If engineers need to perform this technique of repair, the plate should be substantially larger than the damaged area. Investigators found that the plate installed on this 747 was barely the size of the actual damage. Simply put, the damaged skin should have been removed completely from the plane. It wasn't, and the cracks from that tail strike in 1980 stayed on the plane. Still, the engineers and mechanics logged that the repair was done in accordance with Boeing's repair standards. For the next 22 years, the 747 continued service with China Airlines, unbeknownst to anyone that the plane's skin was still damaged, hidden away beneath a patch, making the outward appearance of the skin look completely normal. Underneath the patchwork, those cracks began to spread. Takeoff after takeoff, landing after landing, carrying millions of passengers around the world, the problem remained dormant. Years and decades would go by, and things would begin to change with the times. The plane itself received a different registration. It had been repainted in a new livery to reflect the rebranding at China Airlines. Multiple routine maintenance checks were carried out. The old Hong Kong airport that the plane used to frequent closed and was replaced with a newer airport. No one would ever pick up on that old piece of maintenance from all those years ago. Over time, the constant stresses of flight allowed the weakness to develop further due to metal fatigue. Interesting to note, there were in fact multiple instances where China Airlines may have discovered the failed repair. Following a metal fatigue incident on a Boeing 737 in Hawaii in 1988, it was mandated that airlines around the world review aircraft skin on older planes, including aging 747s. A telltale sign of a hole had also developed. China Airlines had allowed smoking on their planes for years throughout the 1980s and 90s. This smoke-filled air was forced out the back of the plane, even exiting the aircraft through the cracked hull. Over time, leakage had left a large nicotine stain on the skin's surface. Regardless, no one ever picked up on the damage. This takes us to May 25th, 2002. It was a Saturday, and the pilots likely didn't suspect much when they turned up for work that day. 51-year-old Captain Yi Ching-fong, 52-year-old Captain acting as First Officer Xie Yaxiong, and 54-year-old Flight Engineer Chao Senkyo boarded the plane along with 222 other passengers and crew for Flight 611 to Hong Kong. The plane was pushed back from the gate in Taipei at just before 3 in the afternoon. The plane was airborne for its fateful flight by 3:07. Following the takeoff, the pilots checked in with air traffic control, climbing up to their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The pilots received their last instruction from controllers at 3:16. The passengers in the cabin began settling in for their journey, as the seatbelt sign had been turned off, the flight attendants possibly even beginning their cabin service. 3:24. A comment on the cockpit voice recording transcripts indicate that the pilots were observing their instruments, calling out the remaining altitude climb. As the plane climbed, the skin of the plane expanded. All passenger planes do this. The pressurized inside of a passenger plane pushes against the skin of a plane at high altitude, where the outside air is of a lower air density. When a plane descends, the skin contracts. This repetitive sequence over the previous 22 years contributed to the development of structural weakness on the accident plane. Every flight the plane performed in that time, it got worse. It was on this day where this flight became the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, as it were. In a moment, at around 3:28 in the afternoon, the fatigued structure shattered. Cracks began to spread outward from the tail strike area. It is believed that cracks encircled the fuselage at the rear. The plane was now hanging by a thread. What followed was the disintegration of the entire aircraft. The plane broke into a number of distinctively large sections, fragments that were large enough that they returned radar echoes to air traffic control. 225 people lost their lives that day, taken in a moment that had been building for over 20 years. Wreckage of the aircraft was strewn over a very large area of the Taiwan Strait. Some fragments that were blown a far distance were recovered on land. Investigators would eventually stumble across that piece of wreckage, the tail strike area. They removed the patch to discover the tail strike scraping underneath. The investigation recommended that China Airlines overhaul their maintenance activities in numerous areas, from ground crew training to the procedures and rules they were to follow. The Taiwanese air carrier had developed a somewhat negative reputation over the years. The airline had a poor safety record, with numerous hull losses and fatal accidents leading up to Flight 611, which to this day remains the deadliest air disaster involving Taiwan. Things would improve at China Airlines though. Newer aircraft were acquired and the older generation 747s were phased out. In 2007, a hull loss of a China Airlines Boeing 737 occurred in Japan, but was non-fatal. Today, China Airlines operates a modern fleet of mostly Airbus planes. Flight 611 was the last fatal accident at the airline. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. I know this has been a shorter one this week compared to other recent videos. It's been a very busy week on my end, and when this video goes out, my birthday would have been yesterday. So yeah, I am recording this segment on my birthday. It's time once again to take a moment to thank my patrons over on Patreon for their amazing support. Shout out this week to new patron Nathan Huffman. Thank you so much for pledging. The names of the Patreon supporters are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you see your name here, a massive thanks to you. If you want to support the channel further, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new content 48 hours before it goes out publicly on YouTube. Anyway, I think that's where we'll call it a day. If you like this video, be sure to be subscribed, as there is always a new video every Saturday. My personal Twitter page will be linked in this video's description, so if you want to follow that, it's there if you want to. And with all of that said, I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!